European dialogue is starting perhaps a long-going project on what's going on here in Britain with regard to the Brexit, how the situation will develop, and how it can influence relationship between Britain and Europe, between Britain and Russia. And we are lucky to get our honorable speaker who is starting this set of interviews, Джеймсом Никси, who leads Russia and Eurasia program in the Royal Institute for International Relations, Chäтэm Haus. Could you please, James, tell us how exactly you view the current situation and possibilities for its development?
Right, thank you very much. So obviously this is a process right now, Brexit, very much fluid. It's like water. It's happening as we speak. Only today the Supreme Court has ruled that the prorogation of Parliament in the UK, which meant that Brexit could not be debated, was unlawful, so Parliament will have to return, which means that there will be more of a democratic debate on Brexit, which is in itself a huge deal. In general, again, then the country is split. Of course, what country is not split? All countries are split. USA, Ukraine, all countries are split. But these days, people identify in the UK far more with being a Brexit voter or a Remain voter than they do by being Conservative, Labour or Lib Dem. So it is the issue that everybody is talking about. It's the issue that everybody is tired of. The discussions are endless and often vituperous. They are quite, they can break up friendships. A little bit like I heard in Russia a bit, where the issue of Crimea and Ukraine actually split up families. They couldn't talk to each other for a while, and it's become a very no-no subject at dinner tables. So right now, the UK is in a constitutional crisis without having a constitution. And it's set to carry on at least until the end of this year, and nobody knows how this is going to end, so I'm certainly not going to tell you. Now, the interesting thing that we want to talk about, the only thing I can talk about really, is how this might affect relations with Russia, and hopefully we can have a few questions and tentative answers about this. Now, it's reasonably common knowledge, or the orthodox school of thought, that during a referendum in 2016, leave or remain the European Union, that the Russians, the Kremlin, wanted the UK to leave. That's the orthodox school of thought. Actually, for what it's worth, I agree with it, but the reasoning is this. The reasoning is that Brexit causes chaos, that much is pretty self-evident, and that Russia feeds off of the rotting flesh of that chaos. So anything that causes destabilization, that causes discord, helps Russia to get what it wants in everywhere else. So if the enemy, if you like, is distracted by chaos, by Brexit, then that means that the Kremlin is able to do its so-called dirty work in other areas in Europe, get its view across with more receptiveness because of the distractions caused. It's not a bad theory for what it's worth, it's yet to be proven, but it's reasonable to assume, as people said, that the night of the Brexit referendum, or the day after the Brexit referendum, they were popping champagne corks in the Kremlin because they knew that this would debilitate not just the UK, but Europe. And that is true. So if your view is that Russia does indeed thrive in times of tumult, then it does make sense. It is logical. Now, the next question is, what does this mean for the future? That was the past. This is for the future. So there are two schools of thought here. And that is that Brexit will reinforce the hardline attitude of the UK towards aggressive Russia. That's one school of thought. That, and it goes like this. Essentially, that the fact that we are withdrawing from the European Union, supposedly, we'll see, but supposedly, means that we will beef up our relationship with other structures, not least NATO, not least other security structures. So whilst we might relinquish the trophy in trade and economic terms, then we know there will be a compensation for that in security terms. So that means really that the Brits leave the sort of the Franco-German space of wanting rapprochement, a better relationship with Russia, and head more towards the Scandinavian-Baltic space of taking a harder line. And it's relatively easy for the UK to do that in view of specific events, not least Litvinenko and Skripal, but also a number of other specific instances you don't need me to tell you. So that's what's happened. The UK, especially under this Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's behind me now? Yes, indeed. So especially under this Prime Minister, who has been Foreign Secretary, and he said when he became Foreign Secretary he wanted to improve the relationship with Russia. He said that when he left the Foreign Secretaryship, ignominiously, that his main regret was he was naive about Russia. So as Prime Minister, we shall see. He has not had time yet. This is 6 weeks into his Prime Ministership, and his Prime Ministership may only last another 4 weeks, or it may last another 5 or so years. Fine. So there is one school of thought, to recap, which says that the UK will strengthen, hardline its position on Russia as a result of Brexit, particularly under this Prime Minister. Fine. There is an opposing school of thought, and that is that Brexit will be so bad for the UK economically. It'll produce such a downturn. We will recede our trading relationships so much that we will be desperate for other partners, not least partners who were previously considered to be somewhat insalubrious. So that might mean more of a trading relationship with, okay, of course, with Australia, New Zealand, fine, and for US, naturally, Canada, okay, but also with the Russias, the Chinas of this world. Now, this has previously been a no-no for a combination of public lobbying against it, and it was just politically awkward to have a burgeoning trade relationship with Russia in the light of the political relationship. It was felt these two things did not go hand in hand. You couldn't have a worsening relationship and an improving trade relationship. It just didn't mesh. So the idea is, this school of thought number 2, that the UK's poverty, if you like, will force it into being a bit more desperate and coming, if you like, to Russia on bended knee saying, let's trade again, it was all some big horrible error. For what it's worth, I think the first scenario is more likely than the second scenario, but I don't know, and nor does anybody, how bad Brexit will be. I'm instinctively feel that it's going to be bad, but that's probably my own biases and my own prejudices. I suspect it won't be disastrous. The country is not going to become a third world country overnight. But the World Bank does forecast a downturn as a result of Brexit, and we'll just have to see what that enforces. So those are the two opposing views on Brexit, of which I marginally favour the first, which is that Brexit will force the UK, particularly under this government, I mean the Tory government, I mean Mr Johnson, to ensure that there is no weakening of the security strategy such as there is. All of that changes if there is a Jeremy Corbyn government. So if Boris Johnson falls from a perch in some way or other through an election, is deposed, very hard to say right now, as I say, it's fluid, then there is a possibility of a leader in the UK who is far more radically left-wing than we have ever seen before. Not just a Labour Party guy like Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, any of the Miliband's, but really harking back to something really in the 1970s, really before, we've never seen it, is the fact. We've never seen somebody who has such an anti-establishment view, and who is, and he, under a Corbyn government, just this week we've seen that they would, because it's the Labour Party conference as I speak to you now, but they would abolish private schools. That's fine. You can argue that one way or another, no problem at all. You can argue anything one way or another. But if you were to, for example, Google the words Jeremy Corbyn, Morning Star, Russia, you would see an article from him from 2015, I think it is, maybe 2014, I forget, whereby he completely turns on its head the orthodox view of why Russia and the West fell out of love with each other, if they were ever in love. So I think that there would be, just to continue that thought for a second, then Seamus Milne, who is Corbyn's most senior advisor, particularly on these matters, and is a well-known, frankly, Stalinist, really, who was perfectly happy to, chair Vladimir Putin at the Valdai meetings, and has a long track record of not just saying Russia and the West are Russia is no worse than the West, but genuinely believing that it's everything is the West's fault, and there is no onus or burden of blame on Russia. It's quite an extraordinary point of view, and Milne has a considerable influence on Jeremy Corbyn. So, in spite of what I said about those two schools of thought earlier, then in fact, under a Jeremy Corbyn government, which is a possibility, call it 50-50 for what it's worth, then actually we're in a totally new game. And very few people have given any thought to what a UK-Russia relationship would be like, not just under Brexit, but under Corbyn. I'll stop there. Any questions?
Let's add time dimension to these calculations.
Yeah.
For how long do you think Brexit will go on before we'll come to this stage when it will be possible to speculate about British-Russian relationship and so on?
Yeah, that is a tricky question, because we don't know how long Brexit will be going on for. I mean, at the end of it, we were meant to have left last year. The vote to leave was in 2016, and at the moment, Boris Johnson is in an impossible position. You may not have any sympathy for him, but the fact is he's in an impossible position because of the fact that he has committed to leaving on the 31st of October, Halloween, and deal or no deal, as he says, and he seems to be quite happy with no deal, but Parliament is not letting him have no deal. So they are coming to these two sort of vehicles are coming to a collision point on the 31st of October. Now, obviously things can happen. They can come to a deal. There could be a deal on the table, perhaps. There could be some relaxing on the European side, some relaxing on the UK side. It's not impossible. Equally, it is entirely possible that no movement on the UK side, and the Europeans needing to show firmness so as not to pour encourager les autres, and ensure that there's not some sort of slippage in the rest of the EU. They may continue their hard line. So it's very hard to say. So bringing Russia into this equation, as you say, is hard, because right now there is no oxygen to discuss anything else. It's amazing in a way that the wheels of government turn, and that the country works when, if you look at the newspapers, this sort of thing happens. Although I have been in government ministries in recent weeks, and actually the wheels of government are turning. People are doing their jobs. They are thinking about Russia, in fairness, but we'll just have to see. There is a rumour, no more than that the Boris Johnson government, this month actually, but maybe it'll get delayed till next month, I presume, will come out with a grand foreign policy concept. I don't know. It's just rumour mill right now. And that will, of course, include Russia in some sort of fashion, but we don't know what that's going to look like. But I would suggest, going back to those schools of thought I mentioned at the beginning, that if it does do that, this Johnson government, then they will set out a fairly hard line on Russia. So timelines, again, if Brexit were to be completed, that means that the question is over. Obviously there'll still be disagreement, there'll still be passionate Remainers. That discussion will carry on, but there would be a certain game over aspect to that. And I suppose that means that in 2020 the UK could set about thinking about its other relationships, depending on which school of thought they take. let's say, the desperation aspect, the coming to Moscow on bended knee aspect, will only happen if the economic downturn, is particularly severe. So I think what we're seeing here is a situation where the government is still in stasis, paralysis. We have to see how October 31st plays out, then see if the government falls. Johnson is leading in the polls. I suspect he'd win an election anyway, for what it's worth, although we don't know these things these days. Polls in the UK are very unreliable nowadays. And take it from there. But there's not currently the oxygen to give a lot of time to thinking about how the relationship with Russia might develop. Not, by the way, but I think, and I was quite careful in not to use the word improve, because I don't believe it should improve without a foundation. So, of course, we all want a better relationship with Russia. Absolutely, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? But what is important, what I feel is important, not to make the same mistakes again and to have some sort of endless series of resets every couple of years, is that there needs to be a foundation upon which to build that relationship. Unfortunately, what that means is you have to have stuff in common. You have to think reasonably similarly to the opposing side. Not the same, doesn't have to, not necessarily, doesn't have to be that Russia has to become a perfect liberal democracy overnight. But at the moment, the differences are so vast in foreign policy terms, and a little bit on how Russia treats its own populations as well. You look at the recent protests, etc. But particularly in foreign policy terms, there needs to be some form of concession from Moscow in order to begin to make our relationship better. And I haven't yet seen one. I know there's been a bit in Ukraine recently with prisoner swaps, but I don't believe that's going to go very far. Prove me wrong, fine. But the fact is that for a relationship to be better, it needs to have more of a rock-solid foundation than we have seen for many years now.
Okay, thank you. If you are right, and Britain is out and it will take more hard line on Russia.
Yeah.
Does it mean that remaining continental Europe will take softer line with regard to Russia in Britain's absence?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that a lot of Europeans these days are quite contrarian, including the Brits, and they will sort of instinctively do the reverse of what some of their counterparts on the other side of the English Channel or the North Sea tell them. But more than that, there is quite a clear trend these days led by Emmanuel Macron, but also with Angela Merkel being disempowered as well, meaning that they're all looking to have this better relationship with Russia, to warm up relations, to cancel sanctions. They've had enough of it. Skripal for them is in the past. The UK has its own particular relationship. And that means that actually, yes, continental Europe, Romance Europe, Mediterranean Europe, however you want to call it, is different to those of us separated by a sea, and the Scandinavians, and many, but not all, of Eastern Europeans, because Hungary, of course, Slovakia is a bit of an outlier, but the Baltic states, broadly speaking, and Scandinavia remain firm. So I see the probability, but not the certainty, that the UK will, in spite of all its financial compromises, the City of London being a laundromat for Russian money, in spite of that, at least at the political level, taking a harder line on Russia, yes.
Thank you so much, James, and good luck with Brexit.
We'll need it.